It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I'm so glad we have this time together. I'm Sanaa Laybourne, she, her. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from across the country and around the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. We spend a lot of our time on the road, commuting to work, running errands, meeting up with friends and family. In fact, maybe you're listening to this conversation while you're on the road. Data shows that the average American spends about 22,320 minutes, or the equivalent of 15 and a half days per year, driving, and approximately 92% of American households own at least one car. For all the possibilities that roads open up for us, it's not without a cost. To talk more about how roads impact our lives and the lives around us, for better and for worse, today I'm joined by Ben Goldfarb. Ben Goldfarb is an independent conservation journalist. He's the author of Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, which the New York Times named one of the best books of 2023. His previous book, Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, was the winner of the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. Ben's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Science, The Washington Post, National Geographic, and The New York Times, among many others. Ben joins us today. Hi, Ben. I'm so glad to have you here with us.
Hey, Sana, it's good. It's good to be here, and I have to admit that I'm already fully caffeinated today, so I'm just drinking water right now. But don't hold that against me, okay?
I think that is perfectly fine because I'm
Okay.
on cup 2 or 3 or maybe 4. So I'm also very caffeinated, but it's not going to stop me. I'm going to have some more caffeine while we talk.
All
But I'm
right.
just so glad we have this time together because I have to tell you, this book, Crossings, it completely captivated me. I had no clue really, okay, what is road ecology? How is it shaping the future of our planet? But I have a strong love for the open road, as it was really a big part of my childhood. My family, we would drive cross country throughout, in the summertime and even in the winter. And we were the family that had the pop-up camper,
Nice.
the road, the RV. And so being on the open road was just a big part of my childhood. But reading your book, it definitely made me think about all those roads very differently.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great paradoxes of roads, right? Is that they really are how we experience the world around us, and including nature, right? The iconic American road trip, as your family went on when you were a kid. I mean, of course, we did that too, driving to Yellowstone and Acadia, and all of these beautiful national parks around the country. The cars are how we experience this beautiful landscape that we inhabit, even as all of that traffic and the roads that traffic rolls upon are destroying that very same nature. That's kind of the irony, I think, at the heart of this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm wondering, for you, how do you make sense of that? The fact that, roads give us access to see nature, but also to connect maybe with, one another. But then also there's so much destruction and change, sometimes for worse, that roads are also bringing, not just for us as humans, but also for wildlife. Like, how do you make sense of this?
Yeah, it's another paradox. I think it's a challenging thing to think about, right? Because as you say, for us, roads are these incredible forces of social connection and economic activity and freedom, right? I mean, they're how we get to schools and hospitals, and how we get our goods to market, and how the Amazon package shows up on your doorstep, right? So there are all of these social and economic goods that roads provide, and there are these forces again of human mobility and freedom. Jack Kerouac writing about the open road, or Bruce Springsteen singing about it. These are sort of
Hmm.
iconic American cultural touchstones. I mean, everybody celebrates the open highway and all of that freedom it provides us. And I think the thing we have to remember is that for all of the freedom that roads are providing us human beings, they're doing the exact opposite to basically all other beings on this planet, right? They're curtailing
Hmm.
their movement and mobility. They're preventing animals from completing their migrations and finding mates and food and getting to the places they need to go. So that's the duality of roads, I think, are they're enhancers of human momentum and mobility, and they're truncators of wild mobility and freedom.
Absolutely. I mean, here in Tennessee, something that a lot of drivers are probably familiar with are deer, right? We have a lot of deer here in Tennessee and a lot of course, deer vehicle collisions. And I was looking at some data for Tennessee, and our deer vehicle collisions are rising and have been rising over the past couple years.
Hmm.
So 8,000 recorded deer vehicle collisions in 2022, and we're already, on the way to exceeding that in 2023. And I think that's probably one of the ways that people can think about the hazards of roads and driving, right? You see a deer, you don't know what to do. You're wondering, why is this deer just standing there? Why doesn't it get out of the road?
Right.
And, you do talk in the book about deer vehicle collisions. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more. You mentioned like migration patterns, and I'm thinking about that in particular in relation to deer and just their habitat. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how roads are altering migration, how we should maybe be thinking about roads and deer and our relationship with driving and deer and the habitat that we both should be sharing.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Look, I think that the interesting thing about deer in relation to roads is that they're almost part of this feedback loop, right? And I read about this in the book, how until the middle of the 20th century, that there were very few deer on the American landscape. They'd been hunted almost to extinction, which is wild to think about, right? Because now they're all over the place. But in the 1930s or 40s, you would have been pretty hard pressed to find a deer in the United States. But kind of the fascinating thing that happens around the middle of the century is we start creating suburbs, right? And it's really the car that births these suburbs. We're building all of these new big interstate highways, and Americans are moving out of cities into this kind of this novel category of landscape, the American suburb. And those suburbs turn out to be incredibly good deer habitat, right? We know that anybody who lives in the suburbs sees a million deer walking around, browsing their garden or landscaping or what have you. If you go to the suburbs of Virginia, for example, there's something like 100 deer per square mile, which is maybe 5 to 10 times more than there were at the time of European arrival in North America. So suburbs are just incredible deer habitat. So in some ways, this explosion of American automobility in the middle of the century created amazing conditions for deer to proliferate, even as those same cars endangered those same deer in a lot of ways, right? And as you say, the drivers themselves were also part of that endangerment. Between 200 and 400 people are killed in these deer crashes every single year. So cars kind of made exploding deer populations a thing, even as cars, even as deer made driving increasingly dangerous. Americans in the middle of the century are driving farther and faster than ever on
Mhm.
these giant new interstate highways, and all of a sudden, here's this 150-pound mammal wandering onto the asphalt, getting in the way and endangering lives on both ends. So this field of science, road ecology, that this book is all about, is in a lot of ways it's deer science. Because as you say, that deer vehicle collision is just the way that so many of us experience the intersection of roads and nature, and it's been that way for 75 years.
Yeah, I guess I was more attuned to it while I was reading this book. I remember I was driving and meeting a friend for breakfast, and I'm driving through like a business park, and I see this deer warning sign, and it made me think about your book. One, because again of this kind of development, suburb creation of suburbs, and here was this, beware of deer, deer crossing sign right here in a very commercial area, but it made me think about that. And then it also made me think about like, wow, would I really have been as aware of this sign and paying attention to it had I not been reading your book? Because as you talk about in the book, we can become a little blind to these animal crossing signs because they're everywhere, and so we can kind of ignore them. Um, but we're talking about, of course, road ecology, and I would be remiss if I did not give you an opportunity to tell our readers exactly what road ecology is. It might seem maybe it's obvious, but could you talk a little bit about what road ecology is and how you became interested in it?
Sure. So road ecology is this field of science that looks at how roads shape nature, and that dead deer by the side of the road, or the dead raccoon or squirrel or opossum, right? Roadkill is sort of the most obvious manifestation of how roads and nature interact, and definitely a lot of road ecology is focused on roadkill, why it happens, why it's such a big problem, how we prevent it. But that's kind of the tip of the iceberg in a lot of ways, right? I mean, you alluded earlier to the ways that roads cut off migration, and that's a big part of road ecology, is understanding how these constant walls of traffic that roll down so many of our highways prevent animals from even attempting to cross roads, and thus deny them access to habitat and prevent them from finding mates. A lot of road ecology is about road noise pollution. The fact that all of this engine and tire noise is a huge stressor for humans as well as for animals. We've got road salt that we apply in enormous quantities, 20 million tons every year on our highways as a de-icer. And all of that salt, runs off into rivers and lakes and streams, and transforms aquatic ecosystems that way. You've got tire particles, bleeding into the environment, killing fish in some parts of the country. So road ecology is, again, it's this big discipline that looks at all of these different connections between our transportation infrastructure and nature, and tries to figure out what we do about them. It's a science that's about documenting problems, but it's also about trying to figure out how we can heal some of these divides that our transportation network creates. As for my own interest, it really goes back a decade. In 2013, I was in Montana writing about wildlife conservation and management, and I had the chance to take a tour of these wildlife crossings on Highway 93 north of Missoula. Wildlife crossings are these bridges and underpasses and tunnels, all of these different passageways that basically allow animals to cross highways safely without getting killed. And I had the chance to go up on top of one of these wildlife bridges that have been built for, elk and grizzly bears and moose and other critters. And it was just such an inspiring thing to see, right? We do so much on this planet to make animals' lives harder and more dangerous. And, here was this multi-million-dollar piece of infrastructure that we built to make their lives safer and easier, hopefully. And I just found that really beautiful and poignant. And it got me thinking about roads and wildlife in a new way. And, a decade later, I'm still kind of on that journey.
Yeah, and we were so glad that you were on that journey because the book, I mean, it's such the writing. I was really there with all these different wildlife. You give a lot of different examples of different conservation efforts, and centering it around some animals that we might be familiar with that kind of draw us in. And I have to admit, there's a chapter about butterflies and really about roadsides as an ecosystem. And the way I was holding my breath for that butterfly that you mentioned, that was laying its eggs. And I was like, if this story ends with this butterfly getting hit by a car, I might have to take a moment to cry. So that's a little spoiler alert for folks when you buy the book, The Butterfly Lives. Okay, so you don't have to have that stress that I had.
Yeah, imagine watching it. It was terrifying.
Right, exactly. But to your point, when we talk about roads and we talk about these wildlife crossings, I really encourage listeners to just Google some different wildlife crossings so they can get the scope of, what a wildlife crossing is and why you were so captured by seeing this, one of these wildlife crossings as well, because they're just really magnificent. Here in Tennessee, there's a project for I-40, one of our highways in Tennessee, a Pigeon River Gorge Wildlife Crossing project. And so that made me excited, again, thinking about how we can preserve wildlife, how we can preserve the ecosystems, or at least hopefully preserve them in some ways, based on, again, some of the problems that we're creating from roads, but also hopefully coming up with some solutions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, and that Pigeon River Gorge project that's a really cool and exciting one. It's interesting. I mean, there have been so many wildlife crossings built out west. I live in
Mhm.
Colorado, and Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Montana. These are the states that are kind of the traditional leaders in wildlife crossing construction. And the reason for that is that out here in the West, we have these big herds of migratory animals, deer and elk and antelope, who move along these really predictable corridors, and they cross highways in the same place every single year. So if, a herd of 1,000 deer crosses a highway and 50 of them get hit, you've got this big pile of carcasses saying, put a wildlife crossing right here, right? Whereas in the East, they're kind of like white-tailed deer all over the place. And it's harder to know where those hot spots are. And I think that historically, a lot of states have kind of said, well, like, this is really a problem that we can't deal with in the East. And, those Western states can build these wildlife crossings, but we're not going to worry about that because there are deer everywhere. And you can't really solve this problem with a couple of crossings. But, I think that Pigeon River Gorge is a really good example of, a place where Eastern states, where Tennessee and North Carolina are kind of saying, hey, wait a second, there is this great opportunity to build some of these structures on our own landscape and help, deer, elk, black bears, coyotes, all kinds of different critters who live in around the Smokies. So yeah, it's definitely these crossings are becoming more geographically diverse, I think, and that's super exciting.
Yeah, I was definitely excited to find that information because, of course, I was like Googling. I was like, wildlife crossings in Tennessee. Do we have such a thing here? And I figured that, oh, Tennessee, do we care about the animals, right? Like, do we care? And so I was very excited to see that we do care, and there's a lot of excitement around making sure that this wildlife crossing project, comes to fruition, and that we're able to not just protect drivers, which I know a lot of the ways we kind of advocate for different crossings are focusing on us as humans and how it benefits us, but also that we can have a way to take care of the animals as well. Because as you mentioned earlier, and you talk about in the book, do we have this moral obligation, to take care of animals and to take care of the ecosystems that our roads are disrupting?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're exactly right that, historically when we've built these wildlife crossings, we are really focused on human and driver safety. And, look, that makes sense, right? The transportation departments who build these things, I mean, that's their job, is to get drivers safely from point A to point B. So of course they're focused on driver safety. So we tend to build wildlife crossings where there are lots of collisions with, deer and elk and moose and these other big mammals that, mess you up when you hit them. And there are lots of great examples of wildlife crossings that actually pay for themselves really quickly because, if you can build a wildlife crossing that prevents, 50 crashes in a year, well, you're saving so much money to the public on hospital bills and vehicle repairs and tow trucks and insurance costs and so on, that these multi-million-dollar wildlife crossings are actually pretty cheap when you do the long-term cost benefit analysis. But that also means that when we focus on human and driver safety, we don't build crossings for the animals that don't mess your car up, right? We don't really build many wildlife crossings for frogs and salamanders and turtles, all of the little critters out there that are getting run down in gigantic numbers, but aren't killing any people. So I think that's the kind of the future of this field is taking a broader look at the entire ecosystem, not just focusing on, the large game critters, but also looking at the reptiles and amphibians as well, and saying, hey, these animals aren't threats to us drivers, but they also need help.
Yeah, they definitely need help. As I was reading and you talk about some of these, smaller animals or even insects that we don't give a second thought to, that they splatter on our windshield, or, they're underneath our tires and we don't hear, the crunch. It made me think about one of my first road trips as a young adult. I was an undergrad in college and some friends. We hopped in a car and we were going to go to Atlanta. And kind of almost as soon as we hit the highway, we ran over a turtle, and I will
Oh
never
no.
forget that. It was very traumatic. Um, and that memory like resurfaced as I was reading your book about, the animals that we want to take care of, the animals that we think of as, dispensable because there's so many or because they're not causing damage to us. But I think your book really opened, or at least it opened me up as a reader to think about, okay, what about all these other, smaller animals or even insects, and the importance that they hold for our overall environment as well, and what happens when these roads might eliminate entire populations that maybe we can't see or that maybe don't tug at our heartstrings, but are still really important in the world overall.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sorry about that turtle experience. That would definitely be traumatic. I mean, turtles are a great example of that, right? These animals that are sort of disappearing, I think, without us realizing it. Turtles are in some ways like the archetypal roadkill victim, just because they're slow. A deer can get out of the way of a car, but a turtle's not going anywhere, unfortunately. In the case of turtles, the animals who are getting hit are overwhelmingly the females, right? Because the males just hang out in the pond. It's the females who have to leave the pond and go look for, some good sandy soil to lay their eggs in. And often, that sandy soil is along roadsides, or they have to cross roads, looking for a good place to lay. And so, there have been studies showing that, like, there's one famous study in Texas that showed that, and I forget exactly the statistic, but it was something like out of 350 roadkill turtles, 345 of them were females, which is just like a horrific thing to contemplate, because you need those females, of course, for the population to survive. And I think in a lot of cases, because turtles are so long lived, you might drive past a pond and say, oh, look, there are some turtles, they're doing fine. But, those could just be, a few ancient males. There are no females left, and the population is doomed long term. And so, I think turtles are a good example of, again, of a species or a group of species that we're actually losing really quickly here, but we don't recognize it because, there are a few individuals hanging on, even though the larger populations might be doomed because all of their females have been hit by cars.
Oh, the turtles.
Yeah,
So
the poor freaking
and
turtles. I
the
know.
poor turtles. But you bring up an important point, because our roads, our driving habits, they could be leading to extinction of different species. And even our roads and again our traffic patterns and our driving habits can also influence evolution, which I thought was really intriguing. I never even considered that. But you talked about these different birds and how they've been impacted by traffic. And I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit more about that for our listeners.
Yes, this is, I think one of the most interesting stories that I came across and is in the book, is the story of cliff swallows. And so cliff swallows are these beautiful little birds that live in these mud nests that they build on the underside of overpasses and highway bridges. And I'm sure that many listeners have seen these little mud nests with, these beautiful kind of brilliant blue and red birds flitting around them. And so those are cliff swallows. So they're animals that are, really good at taking advantage of human infrastructure and living around people. But of course, if you live on the underside of a highway overpass, obviously that's a dangerous place to be, right? So cliff swallows get hit by cars in many cases, and lots of birds get hit by cars. I think we often don't recognize how many birds get killed because they're so small. You can see the dead deer by the side of the highway, but you don't see the dead sparrow, right? It's just too small and
Mhm.
you're going too quickly. So we don't recognize that, birds are an enormous sort of group that's impacted by cars hugely. So anyway, so cliff swallows are, they become roadkill like so many other birds. But what scientists have documented is that they've actually become less susceptible to roadkill over time. So there's just as many of them out there, but they're not getting hit by cars as frequently. And so this cliff swallow researcher named Charles Brown in Nebraska, what he basically figured out by looking at cliff swallow bodies over the course of many decades is that the reason that they're becoming less vulnerable to roadkill is that their wings are getting shorter. And the reason for that is that if you're a bird, having a long wing is good for flying long, straight distances, whereas having a short wing is good for maneuverability and agility, getting out of the way of, a falcon, a predatory falcon, or, an 18-wheeler barreling down the highway, right? So what was happening in Nebraska is that all of the long-wing cliff swallows were getting hit by cars. The short-wing swallows were avoiding them, and the whole population was evolving through natural selection to develop shorter wings. And, I just think that's so amazing to contemplate, right? We think about evolution as this process that unfolds over thousands or millions of years. It's this incredibly glacial geologic process. And yet, cars and traffic are such a powerful selective pressure that they're literally driving evolution in just a few decades.
That is it's mind blowing, right? For me, when I was reading
Yeah.
that, I was like, oh my goodness, wow. And thinking about, again, just how our roads and our decision making, how that's changing these different animals' lives. Another point that you bring up in the book is that, roads are also shaping our own life, right? We think about us making decisions about where roads are going, but really roads are also shaping how we move, the patterns and things like that. And so I thought that was really interesting to consider this relationship that we have with the roads, with animals with roads, et cetera, and how the roads are really shaping our lives as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's kind of eerie almost how the ways in which roads affect nature and the way they affect our own lives are kind of parallel. I always think about road noise as being one really powerful example of that, right? That we know that, for wild animals, road noise is this huge form of habitat loss. If you're a songbird who has to, sing to attract a mate and, you can't be heard over the sound of engines and tires, then, you functionally can't live in that place, right? Or you can't find a mate. If you're an owl who has to listen constantly for the crunch of a mouse's feet in the leaf litter, if you can't hear the mouse's footsteps, then you can't hunt there, right? So road noise is this huge form of habitat loss for many wild animals. A road itself might only be 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet this kind of acoustic envelope of billowing noise pollution can cover a couple of miles in some cases. And, road noise is affecting our lives in really similar ways, right? There's been lots of research showing that, road noise elevates our blood pressures and our cortisol levels, and thus makes us more susceptible to cardiac disease and stroke and diabetes and all of these other health problems. There's one amazing study in Paris that I cite in the book that basically found that people living in the noisiest neighborhoods in Paris, controlling for all other variables, lived for 3 fewer years than people in the quietest neighborhoods, right? So road noise is,
Wow.
literally taking years off of our lives. And, I think we don't really recognize that in a lot of ways. We're so awash in road noise that we don't always notice it, even though it's sort of this subtle background stressor that's omnipresent in our lives and is really messing us up.
Yeah, it really is. I was so intrigued by this idea of acoustic ecology that you're, referring to implicitly, and just thinking about again how even a very, low speed road is still causing lots of damage when you're thinking about that habitat loss or the ability for different animals to find prey or to navigate a space, and even impacting migration as well. And so it just gave me so much more to think about. And now, as I've been driving over these past few weeks while I've been reading the book, I'm just more conscious of like, okay, what is this road doing to me, to the wildlife. And I think I've been more conscious of just observing even roadsides, looking for roadkill, but then also looking for what is on the sides of the roads, right? Is it grass? Is it some other type of like vegetation or what? And what might that decision making, right? What was the intentionality behind why these roads have been constructed in this way?
Yeah, that was really my intent, was to take, the fun American road trip and make it kind of depressing and academic. No, I mean, no, I mean, truly, in some ways, that really is the intent of the book, right? Is to, to make us see these things that we use every day in a different way. I mean, there's such ubiquitous features in our lives. Roads are, we drive on them daily, that we don't really recognize them or notice them at all. They're in some ways invisible to us. And yet, as you say, they're these products of human design and engineering and decision making and planning. There's so much that goes into them socially and ecologically, and they're weighted with so much history, obviously, as well, right? I mean, so many urban freeways in the US, including in Memphis and Nashville, are sort of very deliberately routed through communities of color, in sort of profoundly racist ways, and have had enormous, historical legacies on, I mean, name an American city, LA, Minneapolis, Miami, Syracuse, et cetera, et cetera. So, these structures, these roads that we use kind of unthinkingly every day are freighted with history and racism and social engineering and public policy. They're just incredibly complex and really profound structures to contemplate, I think.
Absolutely. I love that you talked about that in the book as well, like the legacy of our roads, the intentionality of our roads, particularly as we think about how roads have destroyed communities of color and the decisions on where to place a highway, right? And things like that. But it also gave me some hope and encouragement to learn about freeway revolts. I had never heard about
Yeah.
revolts before, or even how, again, decision making about, okay, well, let's not expand a highway like in Syracuse, but instead, let's see if we can reroute traffic and try to change some of the damage that we've created to our human communities through the decisions that were made decades ago about highways. So that gave me some hope that we could think about, roads, or maybe even undo some of the damage that we've created, as we think about, what type of world do we want to live in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with it, I mean, so that, those freeway revolts that you're talking about, that's this social movement in the 1960s and early 70s to prevent, these giant new urban freeways from being built in many cities. And they kind of had a mixed success. There were some places where, the freeway fighters definitely prevailed. New York City, very, very famously, and other places where the white urban planners won and, punched a freeway through a city. But what's exciting is that today, in some ways, we're in the middle of this new wave of freeway rebellion. There are communities all over the country who are thinking about roads in a new way. In part because these giant urban freeways that we built in the middle of the century, in many cases, are kind of nearing the end of their design life. And so, in Syracuse, which I write about in the book, as one sort of archetypal example of this, I-81, which was routed very deliberately through the 15th Ward, a historic, vibrant Black community, that freeway is kind of reaching the end of its life. It's sort of increasingly decrepit and unsafe, and it doesn't meet modern design standards. And, so there, a few years ago, the New York State Department of Transportation basically had a decision to make. Do we spend a huge amount of money kind of retrofitting and rebuilding this, this freeway that has done enormous social damage to the fabric of Syracuse? Or, do we tear this thing down and replace it with, an urban street level boulevard known as the community grid, and try to undo some of the destruction? And, in the case of Syracuse, they decided on the latter, that they're going to tear down this giant, monolithic, sun blotting, hideous viaduct, and really reconstruct that neighborhood, which is incredibly exciting. And they've done similar things in Rochester and Milwaukee and elsewhere. So it's true that these structures that we built 70 years ago, I mean, they do feel permanent on the landscape. They're so enormous and literally concrete, and yet they need not be permanent. We really can tear some of these historic racist monuments down. It's kind of like tearing down Confederate statues.
Yes, we can do it. We've done that here in Memphis, and we can do that with these roads as well. So that did make me excited, and I have to admit now I'm kind of like keeping my eye on the community grid to see how that continues to unfold because that was a rather recent decision, and I'm sure there is a lot of a lot more that will have to go into making that a complete reality. So, but it's exciting to see that again, like you said, there's precedent for these changes and thinking about how we can interact with our environment in a different way, that it doesn't always have to be the way it's been.
Yeah.
But yeah, something else that really struck me, because again, like I have never thought about roads this much. This much, right? But you talk about road decommissioning as well. So not just thinking about these highways, but or these super highways, but roads. And that we can't just say, okay, well, we realize that maybe this road wasn't the best idea, and we can't just abandon it and expect that, oh, nature is going to heal itself. But that we have to be really intentional about correcting the disruptions that the roads cause. And that really struck me, particularly because of the examples that you shared in the book about even in like national parks where roads have been decommissioned, and the different impacts that that has had on the environment. And so I was just curious about if you think there will be more roads decommissioned, particularly in our national parks, or what that future might look like.
Yeah, it's such a good question. So in the book, I really write a lot about our national forests. Another kind of giant category of public land that we have. A lot of out west, and there's there are also plenty of national forests in the southeast too, where most of your listeners are. So national forests, I think, unbeknownst to most people, the U.S. Forest Service is the single largest road manager in the world, right? Which is kind of like mind blowing, much bigger than the Federal Highway Administration. There are close to 400,000 miles of Forest Service road all over this country, and in some cases, these remote parts of Idaho and Montana and Wyoming actually have higher road densities than like New York City, because there are just so many old logging roads and firefighting roads and recreation roads and ATV trails. It's pretty surreal to be in some of these places where you're just again out so far from any interstate highway, and yet the hillsides are just like striped with roads like rice terraces or something. It's really just incredible to see. And so in that case, those roads might be super remote, very low traffic, and yet they still have lots of environmental impacts. They're like bleeding sediment into streams and smothering fish, and they're triggering landslides that are destroying forests and so on. All of these dirt roads are constantly kind of melting and just dumping silt into nature, and so what the Forest Service has done, as you say, is kind of decommission those roads, basically take this heavy machinery, excavators, front loaders, basically the same yellow Tonka toys that were used to build the road in the first place, and just chew that road up, and just kind of like turn it into a big mess, basically, and then start replanting it with vegetation and kind of let nature restore it. And it's it was really inspiring, and in working on this book, I got to go to a few places where this road decommissioning had been done in Montana and Idaho, and 20 years on, you would have no idea that a road was ever there. It's pretty remarkable that we really can restore these structures. And so I find that really exciting too, that you sort of think about roads at two ends of the spatial spectrum. You've got these gigantic urban freeways, in places like Syracuse, and then you've got these little tiny dirt threads out in the middle of nowhere in Montana, and yet they're both having huge social and environmental impacts, and we're doing work to destroy and remove both of them. And I think that's pretty cool to think about, that the most grandiose paved roads and the most humble, obscure dirt roads are both being removed from the American landscape.
Yeah. I'm wondering for you, as you think about roads and road ecology and even wildlife crossings, are there still some areas, maybe here in the US or even globally, where where you're watching to see if wildlife crossings will be implemented?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really looking at the Midwest and the East Coast. Honestly, like we were talking about earlier. The Western states have done a lot of this work, and the Eastern and Midwestern states not so much. But that's changing. And just this week, actually, there was this really big announcement from the Federal Highway Administration, which is basically that. So in 2021, the Federal Infrastructure Act allocated $350 million for new wildlife crossings, the largest pot of money ever given to this issue. Still not nearly enough, but okay, at least we're starting to make some small amount of progress. And just this week, the Federal Highway Administration basically announced the first third of where that money is going to be spent in the states that received grants to start building wildlife crossings. And some of the big grants went to states who have done a lot of this work before, like Colorado, Wyoming,
Hmm.
Utah, Montana. But some grants also went to Kentucky and Missouri and Connecticut and Nebraska and South Dakota, states that haven't built wildlife crossings before, but are starting to do the research to figure out where they should put them. And so these grants funded sort of those early studies to figure out, okay, where are the the deer collision hotspots, or where are the endangered salamanders that we might care about and want to protect from cars. And so I think that's really exciting. The idea that that states who haven't done a lot of this work in the past now have this pot of funding available to them to start doing that research and figuring out where these crossings should go. And it's not just a Western issue, it's truly a national and global issue.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm very excited about that as well. For our listeners who might be like, wow, I want to learn more or want to get involved in thinking about what we can do about our roads and making sure that we are taking care of wildlife or even just the broader ecosystems. Um, do you have any recommendation for ways they could get involved or even organizations that they could be on the lookout for?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that Pigeon River Gorge project that you mentioned earlier, that's probably the project that's farthest along, in Tennessee, and is definitely really exciting. And there are groups like the Wildlands Network who have worked on that, and the National Parks Conservation Association has done a lot of work on that project as well, and a million others that I'm not going to be able to name. It's this big sort of coalition with lots of different partners. So I definitely look into that project and figure out how to help there. And and then I think that a lot of this issue comes down to the usual good citizen advocacy stuff. Talk to your legislators and write letters and et cetera, et cetera. And look, there are opportunities to influence this issue right now. I'm not sure about Tennessee, but North Carolina, has really very rapidly become a leader in this, this topic. And their legislature has passed some funding for wildlife crossings for the first time. So I think that the southeastern states are getting involved in this issue in a way they haven't before. And there's lots of opportunity, I think, to to do the usual good citizen advocacy stuff to make sure this is truly an issue on the radar screens of legislators.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was very much encouraged by some of the examples that you gave of individual folks who got really involved, right, in their home state or in their home areas and were able to raise awareness and raise money, right, and eventually get wildlife crossings in their area. So I think there's always an opportunity for us as individuals to get excited, get involved, and then connect with organizations who are doing the work or just other folks, other everyday folks who are interested in this issue as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the cool things that I write about in the book is just this idea of sort of volunteer or participatory science, the idea that, look, we're all driving around out there, noticing roadkill, that's potentially really useful data. And there are some great examples of places like California, that have developed apps that
Mhm.
allow everyday, residents of communities to note the roadkill they're seeing. And then that information has actually informed the construction of wildlife crossings in some cases. And so, in a sense, we're all part of this problem, right? We're all driving around, we're all unfortunately, hitting animals. I've certainly hit a number of them. Unfortunately, I'm ashamed to say, but we're also all part of the solution. In insofar as we're, noticing these lives that we're wasting on our road system, and we're all capable of recording that information. And so many, and I can't speak to Tennessee specifically, but so many states like California, Maine, Utah, Idaho, have these really cool sort of participatory science programs that allow people to get involved in this issue. And I think that's a fantastic way of being road ecologists ourselves and contributing to a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And for listeners, of course, you got to grab Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. I guarantee that you're going to be super interested and you're going to want to know what Tennessee is doing or what your home state is doing and get involved in some way because roads are so much a central part of our lives, but also are impacting, again, all the lives around us as well. Ben, thank you so much for joining us here today. Such a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, and I appreciated all your fantastic questions.
Thank you again to Ben Goldfarb. His book is Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And I have to tell you, this book has completely blown my mind. It was such an enlightening read. I mean, we're on the road all the time. And again, there's just so many things we take for granted or that just never really cross our minds about, where these roads are going, right? What the impact is on the rest of the ecosystem, what the impact is on the animals. And this book just opened my eyes to so many of these questions that I didn't even know I had, or these interests that I didn't even know I had. And like I mentioned, as Ben and I first started chatting, being on the road has been an integral part of my life, of my upbringing. That was how we spent our family vacations, hopping in a car, driving cross country or in the RV. And it was a way to see this country, to see different parks and all of that. And so to learn about the impact that roads are having on animals and even on us as humans was so illuminating. And this book has definitely just changed my perspective. And not lying when I tell you, I read this book and had my computer right by my side the entire time because every time Ben was mentioning a different wildlife crossing, I was like, I want to know what this looks like because, you hear wildlife crossing and maybe in your imagination, who knows what image you're conjuring up, but I wanted to know what it looked like and the different animals that were benefiting from these wildlife crossings. And so that was really fun for me too, to be able to Google. And a lot of these wildlife crossings have cameras set up so you can see the different animals that are using the crossings and you really get a sense of how important they are. Of course, if you've ever unfortunately hit a deer or some other large animal, you probably already understand the importance of having a wildlife crossing, maybe a bridge that would go over a highway, or even thinking about tunnels underneath a highway as well that help animals move across the landscape. The other thing that I'll say about this book, besides it absolutely changing your perspective of the roads that you're on every day, is another fun thing for me was that because it is about wildlife, or a lot of it is about wildlife, I also learned about a lot of different animals that I had no idea about. And so I was also Googling all these different animals and found some new, maybe favorite animals. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know that type of animal existed. And so that was really fun. So all that to say, this book was just perfect for the learner in me. I got to learn so much about our world. And I'm guaranteeing that you will as well. So the book, again, is Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And I do have to admit that I'm going to have my eye on that I-40 Pigeon River Gorge Wildlife Crossing project, since that is partly in our great state of Tennessee as well. So this is a wildlife crossing in the Smokies. And so that I was really encouraged by that because certainly, as I said when I was chatting with Ben, like I didn't think Tennessee would care about the animals, but look at us. We also are thinking about wildlife crossings and how we can, benefit animals that we share, our world with. So that makes me excited. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm here every Monday morning, and I hope that you will be here as well. Of course, if you missed any part of this conversation, or like me, you're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I've learned so much, and you want to share it with a friend, be sure to subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format. It makes it super easy for you to re-listen, for you to share the show with a friend. Make sure that you do that. And of course, make sure that you join me again here on WYXR. This is Let's Grab Coffee.